Hi, I'm Alex Cooley.
And I'm Dan Nexon, and you're listening to the Break It Down show.
Yeah, this is pretty cool. I have Mark Safranski and I had an interaction with Dan on Twitter, and that led to Dan and Alex being on the show. So I guess, Mark, tell us why they're here.
We're talking to Dr. Alexander Cooley, Clairteau Professor of Political Science at Barnard College, and also Director of Columbia University's Harriman Institute of Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies, and his co-author, Dr. Daniel Nexon, Associate Professor, Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. And in a personal connection, Dan was the founder of an excellent group, international relations blog, The Duck of Minerva, back in the day, and he currently blogs at Lawyers, Guns, and Money. We're going to be talking about their new book, Exit from Hegemony, The Unraveling of the American Global Order, from Oxford University Press. So the first question I would like to ask is, what inspired the two of you to work together to write this book? It's a foreign policy book. It's being released in an election year, and your focus is on the hegemonic order.
I mean, I'll take a crack at that first. Dan and I have been collaborating for a long time, and when I add up the years, over a decade on various projects, and they have all had elements of international ordering into them. In other words, how is the international system structured? What are some of the different organizational dynamics? We had collaborated before on questions, including, what's the structure and the political consequences of the U.S. overseas military basing network, to some work that we did on U.S.-Georgia relations and transnationalism. And so really, we thought that we had seen this acceleration in these dynamics that we had identified over the last few years. And we'd each been busy with solo projects, but we thought the time was right to really push and make more of a kind of a solid argument that what we're seeing now is not just a pendulum shifting back and forth, but there's an unraveling going on. And just one final thing is, I think we were both a bit frustrated that a lot of these dynamics were being discussed in the mainstream media, but they seem to be pinned specifically on this administration, right? It's the Trump administration is leading to this. The international liberal order is collapsing because the Trump administration won't defend it, or it takes values and positions that are antithetical to it. And I think what we wanted to do in the academic realm is show how a lot of these dynamics the main ones were in motion before the Trump administration, and they will be there after November, whoever wins the election. So long-term collaboration, but seeing I think the pressing need for this intervention now, and to put our cards on the table.
So systemic and deep shifting as opposed to a transitory administration.
Exactly. Yeah.
And Dan, from your perspective?
I mean, I think that pretty much covers it. I would just emphasize that the project had its origins in the late 2000s, right? Or knots, whatever we want to call them. So we've been working on this since essentially before the start of the Obama administration. The original project prospectus that I developed was actually something I used to secure a Council of Foreign Relations fellowship when I served in the DoD for a year in Obama's first term. So we were seeing these trends in the mid-2000s. They were intersecting with things that we were interested in, having to do with the rise of China, the development of what at the time was called rogue aid, that is new actors that were providing development assistance and other trade relations and other kinds of economic assistance. And so we had been tracking this for a long time. And what's interesting now is that we got one of the projects got underwritten by the Norwegian Research Council, which helped to fund the book, and that produced a whole lot of stuff both by us and by people we were working with. So what was a little bit interesting about this book from my perspective is that the book itself was really only written as such over the last year. So it all was written based on kind of very new developments and very current affairs, but it really is a much older argument that we were finally motivated to get into book form, in part because we had to write a book for this grant, but in part also because a lot of the debates that Alex referenced that we were seeing playing out in our field and in the mainstream media and foreign policy commentary.
Speaking of your field, you're both political scientists and international relations scholars. For a general audience, how is your perspective, the way you frame problems, the way you look for solutions, different from the way, say, a practitioner who might be a diplomat or a senior politician in the government or a historian or a journalist? How are you framing this problem differently than people from those other backgrounds?
Dan, do you want to kick off this time, just given your dual experience, and then I can chime in?
Yeah, I mean, Alex and I probably come at this a little bit differently based on our substantive areas, but more broadly. So my primary identity, my primary hat in the field of international relations is actually as a theorist, right? So I'm really interested in, and I'm not interested in I'm not talking about like ethics, like, when is a war just? What I'm interested in is how can we best conceptualize what the stuff is of international politics in order to have a better handle on it, right? So what are states? What is the relation to the ecology or texture of international politics? Those are the kinds of questions that really motivate me. In my prior work has primarily been comparative historical. So what I did when I was coming out of grad school was I was interested in the comparative dynamics of empires. So in that sense, I'm really kind of interested in these kind of big picture kinds of questions. How are things put together? How does international politics evolve over time? And my perspective really is comparative historical. And in my academic work, by and large, has been very separated from immediate policy concerns or even my political beliefs. This makes this book a little bit unusual in that respect. But I did have this chance as part of this fellowship to spend a year working in the Russia, Eurasia, Ukraine division of the Department of Defense. And that was really an interesting experience for me because I got to see a lot of very on the ground, or at least in the office that is close to the ground, things about how kind of military diplomacy works, how the government works. And so a lot of my thinking since then has been reoriented towards trying to align what I saw about everyday practice of international politics at a kind of desk officer level with how I think about big picture issues. Now, that means that I'm not really all that interested in providing recipes for how we can best do things, right? That's not my policy focus. I'm more interested in understanding how things work and sort of letting people who are better, more competent, have more experience in the policy realm or in the practical realm, if they want to use my work to do something with that, that's great. But I don't feel I don't like overextending my competencies into areas where I don't feel I have it.
So let's talk about that method of looking at, how things would work in terms of what's happening at the ground from a desk officer level. I mean, one of the things that I discovered over and over again, because I would stay and units would rotate over the top of me, right? So I would see them come in and be babies, grow up, figure it out. And then I worked on accelerating their growth. But by and large, we were horribly unreliable at producing a replicable effect. And I'll say the word affect over effect, because we could not establish a legitimate government, no matter how much we trained, no matter how many IVs were stabbed into people's arms, and all these things that we were trying to do to create an impact, to make a government legitimate. I could go outside of the government center to a farmer and ask them 3 questions about what the government had done, and nothing had been done. But the slides that come up and bubble up into the higher echelons all like, hey, it's going so great out here. Nothing bad ever happens, and then what we don't see is that pattern of we're going to open Route X-ray with checkpoints and farmers and merchants will be going up and down this road and it's going to create stability. And then 3 years later, hey, we're going to reopen Route X-ray with checkpoints up and down this road, right? So it's hard once you get above a certain level to see that, I think. How does that impact how you guys think? Because you guys think at the highest level. I mean, we have to connect what I do with what you guys are studying so we can get better implementing what you guys figure out.
Yeah, I mean, I think, my own perspective is I have always been interested in more contemporary kinds of issues and dynamics, and especially in the post-Soviet region. And even more narrowly, a lot of my projects focus on post-Soviet Central Asia. And so a lot of my research concerns emerged out of seeing, I would say, ground level, I wouldn't term them problems necessarily, but challenges, and also, some dissonance between what was officially being planned and what was going on. And I'll give you one example. The book I did on the politics of U.S. overseas military bases started with an interest in what was happening in Central Asia, to provide logistics and basing access to support OEF. And what struck me, what everyone was talking about Afghanistan, there wasn't a lot of attention as to what this meant for the internal politics of places like Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan and so forth. And, the assumption was that we could disentangle our presence there, right, from the political dynamics in the country. And I found that, I found that problematic, but I also found that curious as a topic. It's like, we've seen this movie before. And so then that took me on this 5-year detour. I did research in Okinawa, in South Korea, in the Azores, Turkey, Greece, trying to figure out how the US military presence, through no intention of its own usually, becomes entangled, implicated in these local political agendas. So that's a long way of answering your questions. Sometimes how you draw things up and the PowerPoints and the strategies, when they meet local actors who have their own agendas, who aren't acting in necessarily good faith, right? They're acting, mayors, regional governors, opposition politicians. They're trying to get political juice from what's going on and spin things their way. And at that point, things can become unpredictable, and politically, they can become interesting to academics and a real pain for people who are on the ground. And I saw a lot of that in Central Asia.
Let me push back too and add a different perspective on this. Is those players on the ground are often the problem. God's honest truth is, most of the time I spent unfucking what we were doing in the greater area. So we want to build schools and have kids go to school. Oh, by the way, if kids go to this school, they're instantly going to be targeted as a family, and so it all craters. So we polluted the water more than they did. And whenever they said corruption, I would look at us handing out money to corrupt the system that we were trying to support. So we are such a problem with this entanglement. Like, we actually are the means of the entanglement, where I would explain to every commander, they're like, what can you do to help me? And I'm like, well, I can tell you the most important person in the valley, the person that has the most juice. And they would say, great, I'd love to know who that guy is. I'm like, it's you, sir. Wherever you show up, your money, your guns, your power, until you get out of the way and let the government kind of flagell. Is that a thing it can do? Then we can see where the work is. But we refuse to do that. We overworked the problems quite most of the time, and without the proper preparation.
To get into the thesis of the book, what is the American hegemonic system, and what's the role of a hegemon in international affairs? And for the terminology, how is that different than saying, for example, empire, or to use a Cold War term, superpower? And finally, why do you characterize this system as a liberal order?
Well, so basically, hegemon is just a technical term for international leadership. So it's a term of art, and it has a particular etymology that goes back to ancient Greece, and a particular role that involved leading a military coalition of city-states. Yeah, and so So when we talk about hegemon or hegemony, we're invoking a set of international relations arguments about how order happens. How international order happens. That is, how you get norms, rules, and arrangements that look the way that they do. And there's a body of literature called, I call it broadly hegemonic order theory. Sometimes it goes under the name hegemonic stability theory, sometimes power transition theory. And the basic argument in that literature is that the international system is more or less what we call anarchical. It lacks a common authority to make and enforce disputes, which makes certain kinds of cooperation difficult. It makes it difficult, for example, for states or other actors in international politics to, say, do free trade because of the fear that somebody will win out more than they will, and that will lead to, relative losses. So there's a whole bunch of theory about that. And one argument for when you can get fairly robust international order is that when a state is so powerful in a region or a system that it can act kind of like a poor man's world government or a quasi-world government, where it can throw around its weight in ways where it has carrots and sticks that organize relations between other actors. And there's a whole bunch of baggage that goes with that theory, but nonetheless, it's generally been a way of understanding how the United States operated within the Western sphere after 1945, right, within the sort of liberal democratic order and within the capitalist order broadly understood, that it was a global hegemon whose reach kind of extended up to the boundaries of the Soviet system. And then after 1991, the argument is that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States became the first truly global hegemon at a scale that was even much more powerful relatively than Britain was at its peak in the 19th century. That's the argument. And so what that actually means in relation to other things is unclear. You could use, when we talk about superpowers, we're generally talking about states that exercise a hegemonic role, at least in some sphere or some region. So the Soviet Union had its own order, and the United States had its order, and they were both exercised hegemony within those orders. But the relationship to things like empire is much more complicated. So the traditional understanding in a lot of the field, and coming again out of Greek precedents, is that people would often say an empire refers to a condition in which one political community dominates both the foreign and the domestic affairs of another political community, while they would say a hegemon only organizes the international politics of those states. So it can control their foreign policies, but it leaves them alone to do what they would internally. I don't think that's a very useful distinction, because for some of the things we were just listening to, if a really powerful state, when it occupies another country, is affecting its internal affairs enormously. Even when it's not occupying that country, even when it's just deploying troops in a basing arrangement, it reshapes domestic relations. In the modern era, if you're doing things like setting up rules of how states trade with one another, that affects their domestic political economy. So this like foreign policy only versus foreign policy and domestic distinction, I don't think works very well. So my own view is that we should think about hegemony as the condition under which a state uses its superior power and resources to organize relations among some set of other states, and that empire is one way it can do that. Right. So it can do that by establishing governors and viceroys and subalterns, either formally and informally, and really running those states, or it can do it in other ways. And one way it can do it is in a way that we talk about as being the liberal order. Right. So one way it can do it is to prioritize among those relations at least the veneer of sovereign equality. Right. The idea that even if you're weak at some level, we are treating you as an equal juridically. Legally, we have ambassadors, all that sort of stuff, to emphasize forms of intergovernmental relations that are associated with the liberal tradition, like multilateralism, like the idea that where everybody has a voice opportunity, there are voting procedures. Again, in a hegemonic system, the hegemon will be dominant, and often that will be somewhat of a veneer for its own coercive power. But at least you have all those kind of ordering principles. And the thing that to understand is that things like lots of international organizations, things like lots of legal rules that are at stake in international affairs, these are all relatively new. We did not have extensive multilateral arrangements before the latter part of the 19th century, and then they proliferated. They bred like rabbits, right? So now we have tons of international organizations. Generally speaking, the primary mode that great powers related to other states was through spheres of influence or through imperial control. And so this has been a kind of important change in the way that international politics has worked. That's been gradual. It hasn't only been the United States. These trends started in the latter part of the 19th century. They accelerated after World War II. And there was an effort by the United States to sort of create an international system in that image after the entire global order in that image after the Cold War, after the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, and if I could just supplement that a bit. So as Dan says, how is power channeled to organize the international system, right? That's the purpose of ordering. And so do you rely on a set of international organizations, another set of institutions and practices? And I think the less obvious aspect of what hegemons do is they set agendas. They set rules, they set standards, they set norms. And if they do it well and they're dominant, these become almost kinds of given, right? So for example, in the 90s, why is it that all of these countries, a lot of them authoritarian, post-Soviet dictatorship, immediately signed all these human rights treaties? Right? You know, these places like Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan and so forth. Well, they did it because they felt like they had to, right? Even if they weren't planning necessarily on complying, they felt like it's just the thing to be done in this normative backdrop where it's the end of history. The Soviet Union has collapsed. The communism as an ideology has been discredited. You have to be seen to be on board, in this particular case, with democratic and human rights norms. So the kind of givenness quality, right, isn't just there naturally. It's set by a hegemon that sets rules and standards for acting, interacting. Now, sure, there are countries who are always exceptions, but remember in the 1990s, we coined the term rogue state, right, to sort of single out, North Korea, for instance, as a beginning. And that in and of itself sort of emphasized that they were really deviating from what's acceptable behavior and acceptable forms of government. So I think that's the more hidden part of sort of hegemonic power. And that's a lot of what we talk about in the book is shifting now.
Since the theme is that the American led system is unraveling, are hegemonic systems inherently stable or unstable?
So that's an interesting question. There's an enormous debate about that. So there's a school of thought that says that you can only achieve these kinds of robust international orders, whether they take on a more liberal or a more imperial or whatever form, if you have a dominant actor. And that position says that kind of order cannot be supplied, for example, by a group of great powers working together. That's just too unstable, that they'll have conflicts. And so you need really a kind of overarching coercive power. You need a Leviathan internationally. There are other people who say that those systems are inherently unstable because when you have an actor who concentrates so much power, it's really frightening to a lot of other states in the system, that they are at risk constantly of being predated or invaded or pushed around, and they will inevitably try to develop their own capabilities just to protect themselves from the hegemon. We don't actually think that debate, the book doesn't really take a strong position on that debate, because we think that essentially international order can be produced in a lot of different ways. One of them is by dominant actors, but you can have sort of emergent or evolved rules and procedures and practices, ways of doing things in different international systems historically with a lot of different power configurations. Our main contribution to the debate about hegemony is to argue that a lot of the process of what happens during hegemonic unraveling needs a lot of special attention. So the general story about the rise and decline of great powers, which people are probably familiar with even if they don't realize they are, is that a state gains some sort of advantage. Maybe it wins a big war, or it has a big technological breakthrough, like the British have the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, or they develop certain kinds of fighting styles or that allow them to conquer everybody else or to dominate everybody else, and then they become this dominant power. And again, historically, we're not talking about globally. We're often talking about very small spaces, territorially speaking, when you had small systems that didn't interact with one another that much. And then the idea is that the general argument is that over time, that position erodes, usually because of what a very famous late political economist, Robert Gilpin, called, for the law of uneven growth, that just if your economic superiority is really what undergirds the strength of your economy, allows you to pay for a military and do these other things, that eventually other states just do better, right? Eventually your economy is going to not be doing as well as other states, and those states' economies will improve, and then that will over time change relative power, and you'll go into a period of hegemonic decline. And the standard story is that point of decline is really important because that's the point at which you have the potential for big great power wars. So if you're familiar with Allison's The Thucydides Trap, which has made a big splash and sold a lot of copies, he's just popularizing that argument. He's saying, look, the United States is in relative decline. It still can be doing quite well, absolutely, but relatively, China's on the rise. And his argument is historically, when you have a rising power who becomes unhappy with aspects of the international system, wants more status, wants more prestige, wants more say, and a declining power who maybe wants to hold on to their position, that you have a big risk of a great power war. And this is an interpretation of what happened in World War I with the rise of Germany and the decline of the United Kingdom. And that World War II was kind of a continuation of that. There are actually interesting dynamics with World War II, where Hitler was afraid about the long-term power shift towards the Soviet Union and the United States, and may have in part been compelled with the idea he had to conquer Europe now to make Europe a power that was capable of competing with those two rival centers. The same story is supposed to apply to even back to the Spanish Habsburgs, or you even have variants of this argument with the Roman Empire, right? So this
closing is window of opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. So this window of vulnerability where the state that's declining starts to see the writing on the wall and thinks maybe I should attack the other state before I'm at a disadvantage, and the rising state says, "Oh, we can win that." Maybe we should go to war. But we're really interested not in so much whether there's a war or not. We're interested in what happens during that period of economic transformation. And there we argue there are a bunch of processes, a bunch of things that get kicked off that rearrange order even without that big war that's supposed to sweep away everything. And so those are the three things we focus on, is that when there are new actors who are capable of supplying order that is providing, these days it would be development assistance or security guarantees, they start providing alternatives, exit options for states in the old order that can be taken advantage, that those states can take advantage of, that they can use as leverage in their bargaining with the incumbent power. We're also interested in the ways in which rising states actually try to build alternative orders, short of going to war. And the example right now is China building all these new international institutions and organizations and regional fora where it has more say and they more reflect its values. And we're also interested in particularly in the way that these transitions are associated with the rise of what we would now call transnational movements. That is, political parties, social movements that themselves are interested in transforming order, right? That don't like things about, perhaps justifiably, about the way in which international politics is organized and the way it affects their domestic political systems.
You've actually kind of anticipated my next question, Dan, which was about exiting. Why do states, great powers or small, and movements and individuals, especially extremely wealthy individuals, want to exit a liberal order that's providing them with a lot of public international goods? And what does this exiting consist of on the ground or in the arena of international policy?
Yeah, it's a fair question, and I'll put in a couple observations, and maybe Dan can chime in. I think, one thing to sort of step back and think about this is that maintaining international primacy, right? The upkeep of international ordering is costly, and it requires real state capacity across a number of fronts, militarily, diplomatically, in terms of sort of expertise. And it requires a capacity that's also centered around a sense of common purpose and mission and national interest, right? When you do this at a global level, right, there are two perspectives you can take, right? One is that there's a lot of system maintenance that has to go on. And so when you see certain countries falling out of line with expected standards and rules and norms, you have to actually engage with that, right? Even though the country may not in and of itself be vital to the national security and interest of the United States, right? So what happens in a place like Bosnia, take an example of the 1990s, is that the argument is you cannot allow political chaos and war to take place in the heart of Europe, which is the heart of the American-led system. So that's on one side. But ordering is, in some ways, it's unglamorous because it involves this constant policing. right, of these sort of norms and rule sets and so forth, and they become routinized. You get instances with movements, wealthy individuals now who say, why are we doing all this, right? How is this any beneficial to, be involved in these places which are remote, which have been graveyards for empires, which the US has no business being in. And then that starts to, set in motion a set of deconstructing a number of these obligations, right? So why are we involved in the WHO? WHO is potentially corrupt. It's compromised. The Chinese can infiltrate it and so forth. Wouldn't we just be better to just, project our own rules and norms? But once you start tugging at one thread, right, and one aspect of governance and order, and you start unraveling the whole thing, right, then you start losing your power base. And I think that's where we differ, or one of the arguments that we're making is that these aren't just manifestations of power. Say the UN Human Rights Council. Of course, it's hypocritical. We had China, Saudi Arabia, these countries on it, and they are coming out with proclamations that saying, what's happening in Xinjiang and these Uyghur re-education camps is upholding, human rights law. Of course it's not. And so we withdrew from the Human Rights Council prior to that. But now China is setting its own rules and norms and using that institution, right, as a power resource, and we're disengaged from it. So I think the way I look at this is that there are legitimate debates in any one of these areas of governance, right? Beyond the fact that you have self-interested people everywhere in the world who are looking at changing agendas and policies. But cumulatively, it's a term that we've used before. It's like, it's like a death by thousand paper cuts, right? That once this common purpose, this common maintenance starts to slip and unravel, then the overall project itself becomes hollowed out, right? And then, what is the purpose of ordering if you don't have these kinds of sort of common set of sort of values and principles? And so I think that's where we are now in terms of challenges to this. And we could go through sort of a list of different issues from security commitment, public health, development assistance, promoting democracy, international anti-corruption work. We could go through each one of these and see the contestation going on. Dan, I don't know how you think about this or something.
Well, the thing I would stress is that Mark asked there's often a presumption. So there's a bunch of people who sound a little bit like us, who we're in dialogue with, who say the liberal order is falling apart. This is terrible. The liberal order is the best thing that ever happened. Look, it's rules based. It's not like that crazy 19th century anarchy. It's going to prevent another World War II from happening. And those people are often the people who are most in front saying, Trump's destroying the world, right? He's gonna ruin everything, and we're gonna go back to the anarchy of the pre-45 period. And you get he's an isolationist because he doesn't necessarily want to be in the UNHRC or whatever. The liberal order is a very crude term for discussing contemporary international order. It doesn't necessarily mean, as a lot of people assume, that the order is good or benevolent for everybody. So we distinguish, for example, between three different types of liberalism. Political liberalism, which is the idea that Alex has referred to, that's really baked into a lot of things like the UN Human Rights, the UN Charter and stuff like that. This kind of presumption that democracies are better than authoritarian states, that you have some obligations to protect human rights. There's economic liberalism, which is generally understood as some sort of commitment to market exchange, international politics. And then there's what I was talking about earlier, intergovernmental liberalism, right? Multilateralism, sovereign equality, all these types of things. Now, these things are actually all mixed up in weird configurations in the real world. And not only are they mixed up in weird configurations, but they vary in their flavors. So, for example, we used to have a liberal order in the U.S. sphere of influence that was much more about mixed economies, right? So it was much more welfare state oriented, lots of government control over industry going back to like the 50s. We've had since the 70s an increasing neoliberalization of that economy. That is, the liberalism that's come to predominate has been much more favorable towards markets, deregulation, less friendly to big welfare states, particularly in the developing world. And that's where a lot of leftists get all upset and say this is terrible, right? That's where sort of traditional liberals say, hey, it's great. We have a much more kind of market-oriented economy. But all of those things have distributional effects. People win and lose from them. And some of them are more threatening and some of them are better for other actors. So for example, if you are going around in the 90s saying everybody's got to democratize, and we're going to use international instruments, international order to push democratization and protection for human rights. That might sound great if you're in the United States or you're in Britain. It doesn't sound so great if you're running Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan. And it doesn't sound so great if you're running Russia or China, particularly if the United States is looking much more aggressive about doing things like promoting regime change or supporting democratization movements. So that order itself can threaten actors, right? Liberalism sounds great if you're an American, and economic liberalism of some form sounds great until you start thinking about the fact that capital mobility allows kleptocratic regimes to extract lots of resources and then put them in offshore accounts and move them through shell organizations, and actually can be very, very supportive of corruption. So there are always winners and losers in these arrangements, and they mutate over time. It's not a stable thing. The character of liberalism shifts. And so there are a lot of actors who look at a particular domain of liberal order or a particular aspect of it and say, we don't want any of this, right? Or we would rather get this thing. We like the capital mobility because it means we can pilfer our own people, but we really don't want that human rights pressure. And sometimes the existence of more actors who can throw their weight around to shape what that order looks like is going to affect the options, the opportunities for states in that environment.
You guys pointed to a very good example of relative American decline with the withdrawal from the UN Human Rights Council. Back in the late 80s or maybe early 90s, I can't recall, UNESCO, another UN organization, was pushing reordering of information along status lines. They were pushing economic redistribution on a global scale along status lines, and mostly from north to south. And the U.S. crushed that simply by withdrawing from that organization and brought UNESCO to heel quite quickly. That was either late Reagan or early Bush first administration. And with the UN Human Rights Council, that the opposite has occurred, as Alex pointed out. So why is the American hegemonic system unraveling? Does it trace back to Russia exporting corruption in the Yeltsin years? Is it because of our own mistakes and flaws? Is it a confluence of factors? Why is this system unraveling?
It's a good question. Let me just take Russia as an example, just to start off. More than anyone, even more than the Chinese, Russia has been obsessed with this idea of international order and U.S.-led dominance of the international order. They've been talking about this, for well over 15 years officially, that we need to democratize international relations and that the U.S. acts hypocritically. It sets double standards, right? It expects countries to behave in some ways, and then it exempts itself from the rules. And they give a long list of examples, everything from human rights to, intervention in Iraq, to insistence on, Kosovo becoming independent without a UN process and so forth. And in fact, that sort of, for Putin, that really symbolized something, right? This idea that what power is the ability to be the exception, right? Like one set of rules for you, different set of rules for us. So Russia has launched what we call in the book a multi-pronged approach to ordering, right? It's on the one hand, it's tried to create new institutions and orders, right? So it's joined China every time it could on things like creating the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a different security organization in Eurasia, creating its own institutions to establish its dominance in the post-Soviet space, the CSTO, an analogous organization to NATO, and the Eurasian Economic Union, modeled on the European Union, but which was meant to be a Russian-led economic bloc. So it's creating these kinds of ordering institutions. At the same time, the Russians are also trying to support movements, political movements in Europe, Italy, France, Germany, whose domestic agenda is a withdrawal from these ordering institutions or the transatlantic community. And so that's sort of, an attempt to weaken the order in the core of the order itself. And so it engages in both of those. The other area where Russia has not been as successful is trying to provide alternative public goods to certain client states to get them to turn away from the West. And so you saw this actually in Kyrgyzstan, where the US had this base of operations where the Russians tried essentially to bribe the Kyrgyz government to close down the base in exchange for emergency aid. And, Kyrgyz government just turned around, demanded more from the US side and renamed the base, and sort of, a little bit of bizarre politics. And Russia's had a few high-level failures like that, which has led, I think, a lot of the analyst class to say, you see, Russia doesn't really have power, right? It actually fails a lot. It's a declining power. And I think one thing our framework does is like, look, Russia's experimenting. It's throwing a lot of spaghetti at the wall, and it's trying to tug on as many threads as it can find. And in some cases successful, in some it's not. But the overall purpose is it wants to go to a world where the US is no longer the rule setter and agenda setter, to a world where several great powers all have a say in a kind of a pragmatic and opportunistic kind of way. So I think the Russian case gives us kind of a lot of leverage on some of these unraveling dynamics. And as a result, Russia is perfectly happy to be in this asymmetrical relationship with China, where China calls the shots and Russia moves its red lines to accommodate China, because for it, China and Russia they share this common now pushback and challenging of the U.S. led order. So it's the different powers attack different things, some intentionally, some not. But the cumulative effect has exacerbated these unraveling dynamics that we talk about.
Can I just say one thing, which is that, just directly on Mark's question, and I'll also put a plug, we have a Foreign Affairs article coming out in the next issue, which is all about this particular issue. That is why U.S. or why fundamentally order is transforming now. And the very basic reason is the one that everybody's aware of, that's changes in relative economic growth. So the primary driver is the rise of China. And one of the things that we would stress is that China can stall out, right? A lot of this debate is often in terms of, will China replace the US as a hegemon? And our point is that where China is now economically is wealthy enough that it can alter order. And so it's not really a matter of, will China displace the United States? We just live in a different world now. And that's because China and other states have the ability to supply aspects of order, to provide public goods. But let me just put this in very stark contrast. People who want the 90s to be back, who want the US to be the dominant power in the world, right, who want the US to stand astride the world like a colossus, like in the early 2000s, are really confusing a very exceptional, unusual moment in human history for a norm. So there were, in the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, we had a very exceptional, unusual state of affairs, right? Which was that the United States was not only controlling, roughly what it does now, about 24% of global GDP, but also every other wealthy country in the world was a U.S. ally, right? Korea, Japan, Germany, the fledgling European Union. And so there was only, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union, its ordering infrastructure, its aid programs, the U.S. was pretty much the only game in town, right? If you wanted anything like development assistance, like trade, like recognition, like security guarantees that were truly credible, because nobody could actually stop the United States. It was sort of accidentally, momentarily on top of the world. And moreover, because the rival ordering project, Soviet communism, Marxist-Leninism, had collapsed, that also created an ideological vacuum. This is where we get the end of history, right? Oh my gosh, there's no rival to liberalism anymore. But that meant that during the 90s, not only did we have the United States having what we call a monopoly or a cartel with its allies on patronage, which gave it exceptional ordering capability. It also, of course, had a completely outsized military compared to everybody else, not because it was increasing defense spending, but simply because the Soviet Union collapsed. In fact, the United States defense spending in real terms decreased during the 90s. Right? So we were actually drawing back, but we were still much more powerful, both for raw size, but also for technical capacities that we built up from the Cold War process. Also, we were in an era of sort of, where there was a kind of rush to go liberal. And so we had a transnational liberal society the first transnational civil society that developed with the Cold War was incredibly liberal. And I mean that both in the sort of generic sense of pro-market, whatever, but I also mean that in the political sense. It was full of human rights activists. It was full of civil society building organizations. And so the whole zone was kind of flooded with the United States, with its cartel, of aid provision and security guarantees, with liberal actors who were sort of the foot soldiers of liberal ordering in the period, often getting support from the United States and the Europeans, being funded out of Western NGOs or Western foundations or the United States itself. And that was not going to last. And it was just not going to last because that situation was artificial. Russia was going to eventually recover from the 90s. Didn't mean it would have to become another global superpower, but it was going to be back in the game. Everybody could already see what was happening with Chinese growth. The United States did have a tech boom that drove a lot of unexpected growth in the 90s, but that wasn't going to last forever. And so fundamentally, that era had these characteristics that were largely an artifact of the end of the Cold War that were just not going to last. And so now there are just other games in town. And there are new ideological movements. They're drawing on older resources who are, as always, coming up with, looking at the world and saying, this is not how we want the world to be. And as Alex alluded to, and we've alluded to, some of this is at the foot of the United States. It's for its hubris, right? It's for pushing too hard, right? And trying to be too coercive and engaging in too many military interventions. So there are things that the United States did that really pushed this along. But even if the United States hadn't done that, we would have to have a China and other states, regional actors who have wealth, who said, yes, we love exactly the same values of the United States. Yes, we want exactly the world the United States wants. That's the only way we could have maintained that. And that just wasn't going to happen. Right. So that's why we are. Fundamentally, it's changes in the distribution of power that were more or less inevitable after this moment in the 90s, the unipolar moment.
As we look at what it takes to manage a hegemonic system, I guess you would say, is there an actual ability to do that? I mean, we look at the U.S. and the president is the most powerful person in the world. You can't give that person this massive military and say, keep it in Kansas. Like that, presidents don't do that. I mean, they just don't. And then also Survivor, the finale was last night. And, one of the things about that show is like the bottom is so important, right? So let's just say New Zealand is on the bottom of the Five Eyes. At what point do they say, I'm flipping, I'm going to go with China? And then I want to add in this other element too, because our system is so chaotic and it changes left, right, constantly, at least every 8 years, if not within that 8-year gap, we change complete systems, complete leadership. Does that give us the ability to just constantly upset the recipe so that we're always able to more nimble, or is it a more disenabling kind of thing? Kind of a complex question, but this is a complex topic.
It's a great question. Let me just take them in sequence. I think what you put your finger on is something really important with your New Zealand comment, which is the question of tipping points, right? At what point do you figure that, the wind is turning the other way? I see it less as tipping towards going exclusively with someone rather than tipping towards a hedging strategy, right? And Dan and I have written a little bit about this too. It's the idea now that what it's in your political interest is no more to be associated lockstep with the United States and its ordering institutions. Rather, what becomes in your domestic political interest is not to say you're going to be a Chinese client, but you say, we're open to everyone. If we can partner with Russia and China that's great. We're going to do whatever we can to do what's right for, the Filipino people, right? Or the Hungarian people, right? Or the Turkish people. And we're not going to be locked into any one particular hypocritical way of doing things. I think we see that as the next sort of natural progression. It's less the chance that New Zealand's going to ally with China, but rather the opening up to having multiple patrons, security partners, information and intelligence sharing partners. That becomes one of the unraveling dynamics in and of itself. Then on your second point about changes in administration, what we've had traditionally is real continuity in the bureaucracies, in the foreign policy bureaucracies. And sure, priorities change, and certain initiatives do zigzag back and forth between administrations. I think the more fundamental issue here is, are some of these bureaucracies, diplomatic bureaucracies, in a position that they're going to be de-gutted in a way that's going to change their actual purpose and essence in a way that can't be sort of recovered anymore. And I think that's an open question right now. Dan?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to go in here, and I want to have more of a conversation about this. I mean, we have a particular political view of the Trump administration, which is not favorable in terms of some of these dynamics. But I think that there's a lot there. And the thing I just want to stress is that this issue of domestic political polarization and the ability of the United States to act as a hegemonic power is really important. Essentially, we for a long time, the Cold War consensus is, I think, overwrought. There was less of consensus than people think during the Cold War among elites and parties. But nonetheless, there is something to that there was broad agreement on a set of propositions, like you should support NATO, right? Like the United States had to, maybe it had to be softer line or harder line, but Soviet communism was still a major threat to, sort of U.S. identity and U.S. values. And there was disagreements about tactics, but there was no disagreement about the sort of underlying threat profile, I think, within the people who generally won elections and controlled the governmental apparatus. But now what's happened is that foreign policy has been polarized in a way we haven't seen since the 19th century. That is to say that the sort of, if you think it's a cancer, I'll use the analogy, the cancer of every issue becoming either a Democratic or Republican issue, and there not being middle space there, that's seeped into foreign policy now. And one of the things that makes that difficult for as a hegemon is if you want to engage, if you have like proposals, if you think that the order is outmoded, and I think there's good reason to think it is, and you think we need new kinds of arrangements, one thing it means is you can't pass treaties anymore because you're never going to get the threshold in the Senate. So we have the only major treaty we've passed, the only treaty I think we've passed in the last couple of decades was New START, and that was a huge fight, and it was a continuity, and there was still enough kind of Republican support for the basic idea of capping nuclear weapons to do that at the time. But all these tiny irrelevant treaties, like the disabilities treaty, these all went down, right? Because somebody decided it would be a good idea to make that a politicized issue, right? And to talk about U.S. sovereignty or whatever for treaties that really weren't going to affect us in any way.
I think you're correct. It was START, NAFTA, and the WTO agreement was the last thing that went through.
Yeah. Right. And we haven't been able, so that means we've done all these executive agreements. Now, the fact that we're doing all these executive agreements and executive agreement like things, the JCPOA wasn't even an executive agreement, and you have polarization means that if every time you have an election, if a new party takes control of the executive branch, if they're going to reverse policies, that means that the US can't credibly commit to anything anymore, right? It means that you can expect that every time there's a party changeover, and there will always be party changeovers as long as we're a democracy, that US policy will flip, which makes the U.S. very unreliable and very unpredictable as a power. And that's sort of bad for the United States in general, in the sense of we want to make deals with countries that under conditions where the countries will expect us to keep them, and we will we'll expect reciprocity. We want there to be some predictability, but it's really difficult or complicated for the world if we are the most powerful country in the world. And we don't know what the United States position is going to be in 4, 6, or 8 years. And that is going to be a real challenge for the United States moving forward, particularly as the world becomes one in which we still have a really, really large military, but our diplomatic and other influence in relative terms is waning. If that makes any sense, does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. We've had a lot of talks on the show about diplomacy, and it's shocking to think that, I mean, I don't know if you know how many brigades we have, but a brigade's basically 5,000 people. Mm-hmm. That's the entire diplomatic corps, all of it. And you think about trying to run, and I'm saying run, I'm doing quoting fingers, run a diplomatic worldwide program with 5,000 people when there's damn near 200 countries. I don't know how you do that. I don't know how you create the impact that you want to create with diplomacy. Like if it really is like, let's do diplomacy first to last, and then only at the very end do war, we should have a lot more people in the diplomacy business.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that regardless of what you think about the overall foreign policy, one of the real tragedies of certainly the Tillerson era of this administration was the breakdown in continuity in the State Department. And the loss of experienced hands, because even if you think they maybe have policy priorities you don't like, that's an enormous amount of tacit knowledge that the U.S. built up over decades that goes away. I mean, I always assumed that the United States, I think, was going to be in relative decline no matter what. And I always assumed that, like a lot of countries before us, we would have this big hangover of kind of capabilities that would outlast the material basis of them. So you think about Britain, right? Britain, long after it ceased being a great power, had had a very strong reputation in diplomacy, right? Seasoned diplomats, seasoned ambassadors, really kind of supposed to know what it's doing. Now it let its trade negotiation skills completely erode when it handed over to the EU, but nonetheless. And so I thought that would be the United States. And what's weird now is that I think because of these domestic political fights, and the trend of sidelining the State Department goes back many years, right? But we've been carving out some of that capacity at the same time that the country we're supposedly most worried about, China, is engaging in a crash course of funding diplomatic expansion and trying to build the very institutional capabilities that we've taken for granted. So yeah, I agree entirely. One of the things that I fear is that one of the few things that everybody can kind of agree on when it comes down to making budget deals is everybody winds up funding the Defense Department more, right?
Yeah,
that's the sort of trade-off. And I think having a strong military is important, right? We can have a whole bunch of other arguments about what we do with that money. And we can talk about whether or not, how many of those toys you want sitting around if you don't want to be intervening everywhere. But nonetheless, so we just keep on upping our kinetic capabilities, right? While our other foreign policy instruments atrophy. I mean, if you think about what we do now, mostly it's kinetic and it's sanctions, right? And both of those things, that the more you use them, the more it encourages other states to find ways to erode them, right? Or to get around them. So that's, to me, is very concerning, whether you're talking about Democratic or Republican administrations, right?
Well, and then the other thing, too, about the State Department is we can be critical of, nearly every Secretary of State in recent history. I mean, Mark and I talked about this yesterday. I've seen disgusting arrogance from our State Department people in conflict zones where I want to walk out of the room and not be part of what they're saying, because they're completely incapable of being diplomatic. I mean, it's shocking. And so whether it's the Tillerson or Clinton or Kerry and on and on and on, they don't matter. Like we're shitty at that. So if it gets big, how do you ensure that there are good people on the ground? Because I've not seen it. I've only, as a norm, I've seen people that are dismissive of our partners. I'm doing quoting fingers because we don't treat them like partners. We treat them like kids, and it's embarrassing.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that has been well noted for over a decade is that, we talk about the military. I talk about the military as if it's just kinetic power, but it's the rise of military diplomacy.
Yeah.
Right. And so the military has been taking on an increasing number of those functions. And I think the military is sometimes very good at it. Sometimes it's not so good at it, depending on the context. But you're right. From a kind of basic point of view, if you want to maximize your resources, you want to get the most bang for your buck, investing in a lot of these non-kinetic instruments, but also then, investing in the training and the the process and is important. And and I think a lot of these capabilities are ones that we don't miss them until they're completely shocked, right?
Yeah.
Dan, in addition to being a scholar, you've also from time to time been a foreign policy advisor to different political campaigns. I know at the presidential level. What advice would you give to the next president to blunt some of these challenges or shore up the liberal international order and improve our game at liberal ordering and make it more attractive to states that are currently choosing alternatives like Russia or China? What should we do as a country to at least mitigate some of these trends?
So I think that the most important thing we can do is just show up. So while, as you alluded to, you had that great, about UNESCO, there was a time in the 90s where we could pull out of UNESCO and that was it. We can't do that anymore, right? As Alex said, if we pull out of international fora, we just concede them to other states who don't necessarily share our interests or our values. So we just need to show up. And this comes in terms of rebuilding our diplomatic capacity. I think we also need to be less arrogant. And that arrogance isn't just a matter of how we treat other people, but it's a matter of not necessarily expecting to win the fights so much, right? It's okay to lose, right? These diplomatic battles. And it's also okay to get some of what you want and not all of what you want. And we need to be much more used to the idea that we're going to be there, just as there are going to be actors who want to strip certain kinds of protections we think are important, that we should be there fighting for them. But not in a way where, again, if we're going to lose some of these battles, we're going to win some of these battles. And not everything has to be an existential conflict on these issues. Finally, I do think that, so the way we put it is that U.S. global hegemony in most sectors is probably gone because of these exit options, because of these other developments. But there is a question about what our great power status is going to look like in 20 or 30 years. Right? Are we going to be still the most important, most powerful country on the earth among a number of great powers? And that depends on things like whether or not we can hold together what we call the core of the U.S., the American system, right? Whether we can hold together NATO, some of the bilateral alliances, the alliances that still can include something like 70% of world economic activity. And that's going to be a tricky game, not just because we've been increasing anxiety among them a lot recently, among a lot of those allies, but because unless we want to get into the game that we were playing in the Cold War, where we were actually going in and manipulating elections, some of the forces who don't necessarily like those arrangements, they're going to have political power and they're going to be viable in political contests. And I don't think we want to be going in and doing what we did to Italy in the 1960s to prevent the Liga from coming to power, even though I think the Liga is a real threat to American interests in many ways. So I think that I would recommend a kind of a more small c conservative approach to international politics, one in which we show up, we argue for what we believe in, we use the weight of our still substantial capabilities when we need to, we use dollar hegemony when we need to, but we understand that states have other options and that we need to even when we're engaged in coercion to get our way, we need to do so with the aim of outcomes that at least are satisfying for a lot of the parties involved, so that they'll be self-perpetuating, so that the parties will stick with them. So I guess, fundamentally, there are some specific reforms. I think very strongly the U.S. still has the financial centrality and financial power to tackle global corruption. I think that's really one of the most pressing issues for liberal democracy anywhere today. And that I think the U.S. still has an enormous amount of market power that it could use more effectively on the regulatory front, the way that the European Union does and that China does, to try to push for, I would hope, some basic consensus values. Again, primarily I'm concerned about the anti-corruption front. But yeah, so that's, I think, the main thing. I think that we really have to become less reliant on kinetic instruments. We need to think about our military is not in as good shape as it should be, given the kinds of challenges we think are before it. I'm definitely in the camp that thinks that our major concerns are avoiding great power war, and that has to be achieved through a combination of deterrence in diplomacy, and that our deterrence capabilities should be oriented further away from small wars and towards those very kind of standard tactics. Now, of course, what will happen is we'll have another terrorist attack and we'll try to rebuild those capabilities. But maybe if we responded with a little bit more perspective to threats. I mean, I think fundamentally, and I'm nattering a little bit here, but I think fundamentally, and this is where my kind of real liberal progressive views come in, that the really biggest issues facing us right now are in the area of global collective goods. So there are things like climate change. There are things like, as I said, global corruption. And those are things that cannot be achieved simply through military force. And they're things that are going to require some significant concessions by the United States if it wants to build coalitions for them. And I think that that's sort of, again, more broadly, even if you don't believe in climate change or think that's what we should be doing, it's a good indicator, I think, a good example of a situation in which if we go into these negotiations with the assumption in our domestic political system that we are not going to have to give up certain things to get cooperation from other states, then whatever the issue area is, that's bad. That means we're going to be in trouble because we just don't have the capability to throw our weight around the way we used to.
Hey, Pete, do we have time for another question?
I do. Do you, Dan?
I'm good. Yeah.
Yes, we obliged him by the way we asked our question.
Okay.
Yeah, take this one, Mark, and then we'll shut it down after that.
Okay. Alex and yourself, you came with 3 exit outcomes in the end of the book, and one in particular, which was very pessimistic: globalized oligarchy and kleptocracy, which I tend to agree with you guys is a highly probable outcome. How does that sap the ability of the United States or the West in general to mount a response to this challenge of unraveling? How does it prevent us from engaging in effective strategies or selling liberal ordering to other countries?
I mean, I think it has a lot of effects. So on the modeling side, the exemplarist side, that is, in a sense, to the extent that part of the way we sell liberal values and democratic values or American values, again, be careful, when I'm using liberal here, I don't mean, democratic, what Democrats think. I mean, sort of what we take to be core American values as embodied in our foundational documents about, popular sovereignty and the state as a social contract, those sorts of things, right? And that the state's duty is to, within whatever your parameters are, to preserve rights and liberties in a fair, fair economic playground, playing ground, fair economic game, all those sorts of things we associate with liberalism, right? Small L liberalism. So one of the things that we do most effectively is to sell liberalism is we do well as a domestic society, right? A lot of the reason why American values are so attractive, I think that these things are innately attractive. People in general, if you ask them, like the idea of liberty, they like the idea of other types of things, but fundamentally, what looks good internationally is what does well, what seems to be performing really well. And so, nobody would care at all about the Chinese model if the Chinese weren't getting rich, right? And so we have to, on the exemplar side, I think that the extent that our political economy is distorted by corruption, by over-financialization, by the ability of actors to flood the zone with what are for them relatively small amounts of money, but in our political system or for individuals working in around the government revolving door are a ton of money, right? That distorts our policies in ways that make our system less attractive because it tends to do things like exacerbate inequality, or it tends to do things like undermine sort of the general position of ordinary Americans in favor of special, quote unquote, special interests, economic interests. I think in general, if we're selling anti-corruption, it looks really bad for us to be pretty corrupt ourselves. It's hard when you aren't taking strong action to limit the ability of politicians to cash in their, to use their insider trading knowledge to make tons of money, or to use their position to endorse their businesses. It's hard to, or to sort of sell things to the highest bidder. It's hard to tell other countries that you shouldn't be doing the same. And it's also hard for the citizens to look at the United States as an example of what could be, right, as an alternative. So I think it hurts our image in ways that are very specifically tied to the promotion of those values. I think the damage to our priorities is quite significant. So the big example that I think we probably agree on is how overly financialized our economy is. And so, Wall Street is much more important for a lot of politicians, and making sure that money keeps on flowing into the speculative game of Wall Street is much more important. We've institutionalized that through the fact that, we've broken down large pension funds in favor of individual contributions, which then are basically play money for large financial stakeholders, right? We've socialized risk for large corporations, but not for ordinary people. And all of that means that we have a lot of the things that people on both the left and the right are very upset about. We have different diagnoses about how to solve them. But those things, I think, undermine the ability of the U.S. to be a successful model. They also undermine our foreign policy priorities, right? So when we are looking at, Alex alluded to the study of U.S.-Georgia relations, and certainly, I'm very sympathetic towards the plucky Georgians, right? And their and the fact that while they don't look great by a lot of standards in terms of things like corruption, they look a lot better than a lot of former Soviet space, other than the Baltics. But nonetheless, the way that they were able to buy influence and hire lobbyists and affect U.S. policy is very typical for a lot of countries, right? And we see scandal after scandal where even our think tanks are being funded by foreign interest, are now dependent often on foreign funding. I mean, I was funded by the Norwegian Research Council to do work. I'm in bed with a Norwegian Norwegian think tank. Now, the nice thing there is that Norwegians they don't really care what this is more like standard academic funding. We pitch something to them and then we just do whatever we want as long as we fulfill our deliverables. But, those things I think have been distorting priorities for a while. Even think about the ways in which Russia attempted to penetrate the broader Republican Party. We get very focused on Trump, but we know that Russia decided to go after the Republican Party the way that they went after the Liga or the Freedom Party in Austria, and the way that they've generally been trying to subvert, get sort of political groups to support their interests, right? And what did they do? Well, the NRA is a good case study, right? They threw a lot of money into the NRA through Kremlin-aligned oligarchs. They threw junkets where they brought NRA members over to Russia, gave them cool trips to see how good things were, started dangling business opportunities in front of people. This is the standard mechanism by which Russia has built political support among parties that weren't necessarily like all in favor of Russian interests, and has built close relations. And then ultimately, if this goes well, you start compromising people, right? You start putting them in a position where they're in shady business practices with you. Now, I think actually, debating Trump aside, overall, the Republican Party was more resilient. The NRA, of course, is in huge trouble now, in part because of the scandals that this produced. It wasn't like the Liga who wanted these relations, or the Freedom Party that actively wanted these relations so much. But we have opened the door to that sort of thing. It's extremely easy, right, to do that either through shell corporations or dark money or other types of things. We do that externally too, right? U.S. dark money is actually very important in a number of political movements overseas, for example. And so I think that if you imagine that there's Russia's a big obvious example, but there are all these little cases of countries getting their specific interests represented or getting U.S. policy skewed in their direction that maybe it shouldn't be, because they hired the right lobbyists, because they cultivated enough goodwill. And you're never going to get rid of the role of interpersonal ties in foreign policy. We've always had, Taiwan, for example, for a long time was protected by having people in the US government who were very invested in Taiwan in the 70s, for example. That's always going to happen. But we can minimize the way that it happens just out of the fact that, $2 billion for a kleptocrat isn't that much, but it's a ton for the Paul Manafort of the world, or the Tad Devine of the world, or whatever. And so those sorts of things, I think, do affect foreign policy in ways often that we're not even aware of, in terms of how we do our priorities, in terms of what states do better in the bidding war for U.S. development assistance, in terms of who gets particularly policy concessions that may not look significant to the politicians who are passing them, but have regional implications, right, or have implications for our relations with other states. particularly if you don't have a well-institutionalized diplomatic apparatus that's really capable of vetting and trying to shut down that stuff. Does that make? I mean, I sort of talked for a while. I actually think the future could be quite grim in terms of the concentration of global wealth and the way that countries' trade, economic, and foreign policies start to serve interests of, and I think we're down that road further than people realize. And that's one of the reasons you see such a rise of populism. And shockingly enough, populist forces are one of the major internal challenges to the existing order. So, getting our own house in order is a really important thing for shoring up political support for aspects of the order that I think everybody should want to preserve, right? If you won't care about U.S. great power status, for example.
Good luck getting our political house in order. Good grief.
Right.
It's going to take a shop vac. Oh, boy. Listen to everybody. The Exit from Hegemony book is available on Amazon. I put the link in the show notes. Look, Alex's CV is like 10 pages long or something like that. And just it's ridiculous. We're super fortunate to have Daniel and Alex on the show today. These guys know their stuff. And if you're interested at all in this kind of thing, definitely recommend the book. Mark and I have been through it. It's great. Mark, thank you for helping me set this up too. You carried a lot of the weight today.
No problem. Anytime.
Thanks so much for having us, because as you all know, there's nothing that academics hate more than to talk about their own work with a smart audience with good questions for a really long time. I really appreciate it. And it was nice to meet both of you in person, and I hope we get more chances to interact in some way or another. So
for sure.
Thank you, Dan.
All right.